I would say my overall leanings are center right, with a particular concern for due process and freedom of speech and, civil liberties issues, but I hope in a nonpartisan way. I'm concerned with institutions and their legitimacy and the machinery we have set up to make political competition work and to keep things like due process and free speech in place. So in that sense, I think just sort of the liberal constitutional system that we have, is everybody's interest in protecting, not necessarily just the right or the left.
This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is a podcast presently live streaming on Facebook, then goes to YouTube and all the places podcasts go to live or to die. And my guest today is Jason Willick, and I read Jason's pieces in the Washington Post with incredible interest because Jason is one of those writers that refreshingly is hard to pin down ideologically. And sometimes, quote unquote, I agree, and sometimes I disagree. But I am always grateful, Jason, for what I would call your journalistic integrity in the old school sense of really trying to get the facts straight. You judge people's pieces of writing by the bits they write about that you know well personally, like having your old neighborhood described. And if they get it correct, oh, yeah, that's where the barbershop was and the diner, then you kind of trust the rest of it. And where your subjects intersect with things I know a little bit about or people I know personally that you mention, for instance, I often find that you're very dead on accurate. And just before we came on, in fact, I was discussing with my producer, Ernie, where you were, quote, coming from ideologically in a piece, I think from yesterday, about the Supreme Court and the Roberts Court and so forth and so on. And he was saying, well, maybe you're coming from a conservative position because you don't think the Roberts Court ought to rule in favor of the Colorado court. And I was saying, yeah, but I mean, look at this line that he wrote in that same piece. The best way for the court to protect itself is to wrench the cases out of, here's the line I love, the Trump distortion field. And I was saying, that's a journalist writing, and he has his point of view, but I don't think I would like to see your piece labeled one way or another. Have I kind of accurately described what you're after in terms of when you sit down to write something, or am I just wishful thinking here?
Well, it's I appreciate that. I'm glad. I hope that people find my writing, hard to predict, because if it's predictable, then you don't have to read it. But yeah, I would say my overall leanings are center right. With a particular concern for due process and freedom of speech and, civil liberties issues. But I hope in a nonpartisan way. I'm concerned with institutions and their legitimacy and, the machinery we have set up to make political competition work and to keep things like due process and free speech in place. And so in that sense, I think just sort of the liberal constitutional system that we have, is everybody's interest to in protecting, not necessarily just the right or the left.
Yeah, the piece that I contacted you about after I read it, I think was from December 7 on the elite colleges. And you have a paragraph in there, elite college presidents are under fire for their platitudinous responses to this week to high dudgeon questioning by Elsie Stefanik over whether calls for, quote, genocide of the Jews violate the school's policies. And again, in that piece, I was fascinated by the fact that you, first of all, in a way, defended the schools and said, perhaps they should not be fired for expressing an opinion. But then you went on and you said, the episode has the makings of a turning point in the culture wars over higher education. And I'm skipping here. First, justified concern about American campus radicalism cannot obscure the fact that the presidents were objectively right on the free speech merits. So again, I just want to applaud you because here you are writing from a center-right position. You're saying maybe somewhat conservative, but you are defending their right to free speech in the middle of an article that later calls out the universities for their tilt towards the whole diversity, inclusion kind of thing. And again, I just wanted to talk about that particular piece with you because I think that it's really central to the discussion on so many things now. I wondered, what sort of a response did you get to that piece?
I had a very good response. I did because I think there are, which is frankly unusual for me. I mean, as a center right writer at the Washington Post, a lot of the times I mostly get pushback from readers
Sure.
who disagree. But I thought that I did strike. I did win over some people. I felt like perhaps on both sides, with sort of my argument about the college presidents and this whole ongoing fiasco and debate around anti-Semitism and the Israel war and Hamas and free speech. I mean, my I said Elise Stefanik was in high dudgeon. I mean, she was doing a political theater. A lot of people only watched 3 minutes of the questioning out of many hours. And she, did the indignance and was trying to achieve a certain outcome, like a lawyer on cross-examination. But if you, it's important to understand she's trying to make a political point, and they did not respond well and did not do a good job. And but on this idea of calling for genocide, which is sort of a something that she came up with. It was a gotcha situation, right? Because as I point out in the piece, first of all, most anti-Semites are not out there calling for genocide. That's not, they're a lot more subtle than that. And they say things that have deniability. And, so should you be quick as a college president to say, accepting the government's premise of, the kinds of things people are saying, yes, we would punish that in all cases? Well, no. I mean, if, and frankly, I mean, what I find, I drive around here in Washington, D.C., and there's graffiti by pro-Palestinian, groups say stop the genocide. And there's people who call President Biden Genocide Joe. And this is, they are acting as if Israel is committing genocide, which is false. But if I said, from the left, if I said, could somebody support a government committing genocide? And then got the person to say, no, that would be against our policies. And then I say, see, therefore you need to oppose Israel, because Israel, we have just seen that this UN official has said that this is genocide. So it's too complex of an issue to compress into this kind of political cross-examination. So I tried to zoom out a little bit. And I think most people appreciated that, because I think most people are not on the nobody thought the college presidents did a good job, or that they gave good answers, or that the colleges are consistent. But also, I think a lot of people saw that what Stefanik was doing, and that's not, that she was doing some political trickery, which is her job, and that's fine too.
Yeah, no, I really liked the balance. You had this line which sort of brings you up short because you're very honest about it. I like the bluntness of your honesty. Like racist, sexist, homophobic, or anti-Muslim speech, anti-Semitic speech is generally constitutionally protected. Hello, good reminder that free speech is protected. And then you go on to say, to legally constitute harassment, speech must be so pervasive that it interferes with someone's ability to access education. You're thinking of the college campus there, of course. Think of a mob that follows someone around campus or blocks a building. An isolated outburst, social media posts, or protest chant doesn't meet that threshold. And, again, I really appreciate and applaud the kind of sane tone you bring to the discussion, because where I find a lot of your pieces interesting, and I was rolling down through them and realizing that this is the thing with you, is you will dive into a controversial piece, but you will kind of restate the premise. And this is what I really like about it. If you don't want to do this job anymore, you'd make a really good teacher, by the way, because that's what good teaching is. You restate the basic premise. Here's what we're talking about. And I appreciate that. You don't dive into the ideology or even the story right away. You kind of give us, you paint a picture of here is the context. Where does that come from in you? You know, the way to ask that is, you know, what were your interests when you were young? What did you study? What kind of, I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist commune in Switzerland in the 1950s. I'm 71. I'm looking back over a lifetime of change. I left that environment. That's where I come from. I don't want to fish, you know, go more personal than you want to go. But before we go further into the content of what you write about, I'm just, you know, I don't want to ask what you do. I just want to ask, who is Jason? You know, I'm this ex-evangelical and I'm a writer. I write novels. Who are you?
Yeah, I was going to ask, your accent is it from Switzerland or
It's from Switzerland and British boys' private schools that
got
I
it.
was dumped in as a child. And so,
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is, like I said, I consider myself a center right person. I didn't come from, red America or a conservative family. I grew up in a very blue, Bay Area, Northern California, from a family of Democrats, was raised Reformed Jewish. Um, and, um, when I was little, was, always interested in arguing and debating, perhaps, excessively to some people's for some people's taste. But I, parents, mother is a physician. My father passed away, but he was a physicist. Um, and so I was curious about the world. A lot of science and technology people around me in Northern California, but I majored in history. I sort of got more of a humanities interest. If you grow up in Palo Alto, go to Palo Alto schools, you will learn you are not as good at math as you may think. People are
yeah,
that's those kids are very good at math and science. So anyway, um,
my wife's from San
learned.
Mateo, so I know your neck of the woods.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah, we um, competed in mock trial and in tennis against, I think, San Mateo. But
Yeah.
anyway, so that's where I'm from. I graduated from Stanford, um, and I, got an interest in history and political science and journalism. And, my mentors were really Walter Russell Mead, in my first job out of college. He's a historian and writer. Also Raihan Salam, who is another journalist who I worked for shortly out of college.
Hmm.
And that's who I am. And I think so. I think, basically my conservatism, insofar as I'm conservative, and my center right leanings, don't come from being inculcated in Republican values. They more come from uh, growing up in Blue America, going to liberal universities, and sort of um, taking a somewhat different view than the ones that were predominant where I was growing up.
Yeah, well, you know, your journey is very familiar to me, not because we followed the same path or come from the same kind of families, but you know, you seem to recognize at a younger age than I am right now that you're on a journey that includes spirituality, ideology, politics, interests. I mean, you're a student of history, so you know that everything we do or say is a snapshot of where we are that day. You know, I've written enough books and I've been alive long enough that if I look back on things I wrote 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, especially nonfiction stuff where I'm giving an opinion, I often would like another crack at it because I've learned more since, or at least changed my mind on some things. And I think you seem to be the kind of person who's open to that sort of personal evolution. I would guess that. Would that be true?
Yeah, I like to think so. I I I like to think so. I think, my views, I started calling myself sort of center right or conservative probably toward the end of my time in college. Um, and my views were shaped by my mentors, but I really do try to be open-minded for sure.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a conservative environment, and was friends with a lot of Republicans. You're a student of history. My family were friends with Gerald Ford. My dad and mom went and visited the White House a number of times, stayed in the Lincoln bedroom once as Gerald's guests, and we were very much formative in the religious right in the 1970s and 80s. And then I left and went in an opposite direction. But recently, I've just been increasingly troubled, and my producer, Ernie Gregg, and I, with this podcast and my online footprint for what it's worth, have been increasingly troubled by the fact that we're all living in these ideological bubbles and nobody's talking to anybody that they don't already agree with. And I really don't like that. And it gives a false picture of the opposition. I just happen to think that there are conservatives like you who are good writers, reasonable people, informed, and have opinions I want to listen to. And the fact that I often read pieces by you where you very fairly state a side that you might not agree with positively yourself reminds me of my best old friends in the Republican Party, like Jack Kemp, who was a congressman and ran for vice president with Bob Dole. There was a day you could have discussions with people. I don't know how you feel about that, because you're living in the Washington cauldron. Do you have people on the left that you have a good relationship with, or do you kind of, are there folks in the Washington Post office when you come in who won't talk to you because they're on this other side and you're the sort of token conservative guy? I mean, how's that all fall out for you personally?
So, I mean, most people in my life that I interact with are liberals. I mean, my grandmother, who I talk about politics, my mother's kind of apolitical, but a lifelong Democrat. My father-in-law, most of my colleagues are liberal, and I get along with them well, and they've been, it's been a fantastic environment, and everyone's been terrific at the Post. Readers really do not like me. If you ever look at the comments, you will see a barrage of hate. But my colleagues are wonderful, and we have productive debates. I would say, a lot of my friends, my you do make friends in your ideological bubble,
Sure.
in your social life. But it's hard. It's kind of hard, I would say, to live in Washington, D.C. or any metro area and be in such a, as a conservative, you're forced to interact with other people. And I do think it would be interesting to sort of profile, which conservatives in Washington are sort of rebels from Blue America versus which ones, grew up in Red America, and how does that change their approach? Because I think, you react to the excesses that you experience. And if you're in Red America, you may experience more excesses, more clear excesses from that side. I think, my point of view as someone from Blue America and, with friends and family, is you sort of feel like that's where the power is in the country. And so you sort of cut them a little bit less slack, than the sort of conventional anti-Trump, all the corruptions of MAGA and all how terrible it is. From my point of view, some of those have validity, but who really is dominating a lot of the powerful institutions? And so, and insofar as we should be criticizing people with power and scrutinizing the way they use that power, that makes me, pretty sensitive to when I see there's overreach.
Well, that article on the universities is one. Just to reintroduce, my guest is Washington Post columnist Jason Willick, who I follow and read. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. That's what you're listening to now or watching. And to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And Jason writes columns that are from the kind of center-right, that remind me very much of the tone of the kind of conservative Republicans I knew pre-Trump, a long time ago, people like Jack Kemp and others. I think, Jason, one of the things we all suffer from is because the goalposts keep getting moved by extremists on the left and right. The idea of, being in the center or to the left or to the right, of course, is kind of a movable definition, because one generation center left is the next generation center. And the generation after that, they look to the right because they still hang on to the validity of, say, certain terms, pre-pronoun, whatever. The goalposts keep moving. So I don't put much store by ideology and definitions, and I'd rather just talk to reasonable people, whatever flag they sail under. I want to read something from this article that you wrote on the universities. Speech supportive of Israel's war in Gaza could also be deemed genocidal by activists. See how the University of Southern California briefly borrowed a professor from campus for saying Hamas members should be killed, creating a new, quote, genocide category of punishable speech would suppress and distort debate on the Israel-Gaza war. Debates about China and Russia, also accused by some of genocide, would also be chilled. And then I added a but in just to make the sense of it. Second, but the university president's professed commitment to First Amendment principles rang false. U.S. higher education, especially over the last decade, has become increasingly intolerant of views that do not conform to progressive ideology. And that's a true statement. I live just north of Boston. I have friends that teach at Harvard. I've spoken at, all the famous schools as a writer who's been on tour with books that have been in the news at the time. And I must say, anybody who thinks that campuses are open to a diverse range of viewpoints has not talked to professors who are trying to get tenure and who are tailoring what they are saying to match liberal fashions or colors of skin or gender or whatever it may be. This is a very, very real problem. I know this isn't the only article you've written about. What was your own experience? You weren't at Stanford that long ago. And then how do you look at this wider issue? Forget labels of Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal. I just want to pick your brain for a minute because I'm very interested in your opinions. What do you make of the prestige elements of higher education these days? What is the problem that's real? You're defending free speech, but what has happened, in your view, on campuses to make them so narrowly focused on these kind of gender-specific, race-specific, inclusive categories that almost like corporate America, has done the same thing? There is something going on that I, as a liberal, or she might say an old school lefty, find equally disturbing. Just when it comes to free speech and association, what are your thoughts on this beyond that article? Because I really want to get into that with you.
Yeah, so I graduated from Stanford in 2015. And I think that was just the beginning of sort of this latest trend. I mean, I think it's been going on for about 10 years, less than 10 years. If you talk to Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a nonprofit in Philadelphia, well, I think that was their name when I interned at them in 2014. Now they're more broad than education. They're Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. But, they detect in their data a big uptick starting around 2014. So I experienced the beginnings of it, I would say, the beginnings of the campus, the new left on campus, the sort of heightening of intolerance on campus. And you could see some early signs of it. And I think it's disastrous. I mean, I think it's disastrous for trust in expertise, which people claim to want. I mean, so often this is an example of what I'm talking about with, how you see the left versus the right. People complain, well, populists on the right don't trust experts. It's like, well, look at what's happening in the universities and the credentialing institutions. How can somebody really have confidence that if a sociologist had a contrary idea to the predominant or politically preferred one, that they would feel comfortable making that argument? If is there really intellectual competition that's going to yield robust outcomes here? So I think it's a real problem, and it's been especially in the last 10 years. And it's part of, there's a lot of debate about, what's going on. That was the end of the Obama term, of Obama's second term. Was there disappointment with his second term or, disappointment among liberals? I mean, because if you look at the way President Obama spoke toward the beginning of his term and in his 2004 speech, it was this very post-racial, post-identitarian, we're all Americans, there's no red America kind of way, and that really sort of curdled by the end of it among the left into a much harder edged, more identitarian kind of politics. I don't know exactly why that happened when it did. some people talk about the influence of social media. And it's there has definitely been a big difference in how we communicate, which affects the substance of what we say too. But that's a huge problem, and that's fundamentally why the anti-Semitism testimony and the free speech defense rang so hollow to people, because nobody thinks that free expression is the priority of these of most top universities.
Yeah, and I know that to be true because I know people very far to the left who are teaching at Harvard and other places. And what has interested me, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, I forget to whom, but one of the giveaways for me that there's something rotten in the state of higher education is that I meet more and more people in higher education, irrespective of their political views, who, on a whole range of discussions related to not just race and ethnicity and gender, but everything, do something that I never experienced before in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s when I was all over the map politically, but in many, many discussions with people. And that is, they will tell me something, look, this is what I think, but of course I can't say that in public.
Yeah.
And that's a really bad sign, because it means we're no longer living in the environment that I took for granted as an American citizen. Across the board, whether it was sexuality or anything else. It kind of reminds me of the days of my closeted gay friends who would tell me who they were, but of course I can't say that in public. And I know that's an extreme example, but it's not that far-fetched. So it's really amazing to me to know people who, for instance, helped found left-wing organizations with feminist agendas or pro-choice agendas or whatever it may be, who in many discussions on many topics will say, well, here's what I think, and this is what I think has happened, fill in the blank. But of course, I can't say that in public. I mean, to me, that's a devastating critique in itself of the whole knowledge class and what used to be called the chattering classes, because that's new.
Yeah, and I think, there's two elements of one's politics. There's substance, and then there's the process. So, I can be pro-choice, but support, but not be against people who are pro-life, having their say. Or I can be anti-affirmative action, but or anti-Israel or pro-Israel. But there's both the process, the substance of which policy you'd prefer, and the process of, do you support, due process for the other side when they're accused, and their right to make the debate on equal footing with you. And I feel strongly that those need to be separate, that no matter what your view is of the substance, you need to support a fair process to hash it out. A more cynical view of human nature is, there's really not a difference. When people are saying they support free speech, that's just because they want speech that goes against the current conventional wisdom and they want to overthrow it. And once they're in charge, they don't want as much free speech. And, that's arguably what kind of happened with the free speech movement on campus, which was a left-wing movement and spoke to these high principles of free speech. But then, once the veterans of that were in power, they kind of didn't really see free speech as that useful anymore. And I think, and that's human nature. It's not in our nature to want to indulge people who are wanting things that we think will hurt us or will hurt people we care about. But I think, that's sort of the nub of, our current problems is that, overcoming that impulse and trying to maintain the fair process, trying to keep the process separate from whatever the substances that you want. Because I think, now and you're seeing the same, frankly, on the right now. Some people on the right who now, have been supporting free speech on campus, or who have been, decrying left-wing intolerance, they think, well, once we get into power, we're going to kind of, we're going to do what they did to us, as a way of putting it. And again, this is a very natural impulse, and I'm not naive. Like, of course, there's going to be some bias based on your policy preferences. But I think on the whole, that's something that has to be resisted, because it ultimately, it just leads to the collapse of these principles that make it possible to have a free debate.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. This is completely off what we're talking about now, although related. this is not a rhetorical question. I'm not angling for anything here. I just am really interested to pick your brains as an observer of our culture. What do you make of these multi-billionaire, almost trillionaire tech bros who have really, we're talking about Elon Musk, we're talking about Mark Zuckerberg and so forth, who, in terms of the most benign interpretation, have landed us all in very, very deep waters when it comes to putting us in these information bubbles. And, Musk's algorithms have been credited with the destruction of democracy around the world in some ways, and certainly, if nothing else, child trafficking. And yet now he's bought this big property in Hawaii and he's going to build a $200 million bunker to survive whatever comes next. It just seems to me
Wait, are you
that
talking about Elon?
I'm talking about not Musk. I'm talking about Zuckerberg.
Oh,
Did I say Musk?
yes. Well, you said,
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm talking about Zuckerberg. But anyway, as an observer who's, pre-cell phone guy, landlines to phones to thing to now my teenage grandchildren and watching them with their phones and so forth and so on. I'm wondering, as someone of your generation who's also an acute observer of the culture around us, what you make of the impact on what you do, which is journalism and the study of history and trying to put a context to things. How does that play with the fact that, to be cynical for a minute, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are no longer the media? The media is a kid with the cell phone doing a 30-second clip out of Gaza that's now on TikTok, manipulated or not by the Chinese government, whatever that may be. How do you see what big tech has done to us? What is the context as it impacts what you do as a serious writer with a fact checker who goes through your material? Because whether you love, my guest Jason Willick's posts or not, this is a serious guy who's doing more than sending out little messages on a cell phone. And yet, in a way, the currency of words, expression, thought is so devalued now that certainly as a writer who writes books and tries to drop them over the parapet into this environment, I get very discouraged thinking, well, not only who's going to read them, but is this even possible anymore? Am I totally fooling myself when I write a book? And I wonder if you ever question that about your columns in this context.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame the CEOs of the companies. I think sort of the technological change is going to happen no matter who the founder is, but there's definitely a huge technological change going on, and it's sort of cliched by now to compare it to the printing press and the way that changed communication and frankly led to a lot of religious wars and bloodshed. But I do think I have thought a lot about the way that the changes in communication, change our brains and our ability to engage. I think, I guess I'm mindful of the tendency that when there's a new technology, people overstate, how much it's going to doom our ability to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think that we are going to, master this technology and find a new equilibrium. But in the meantime, we're finding, I mean, one book that's a great book is Martin Gurry's Revolt of the Public. And he talks about how sort of technology and the way that it's so much easier for everyone to access and send information, has led to huge political instability. I think there's no question about that. But yeah, it's the printing press was the beginning of the use of written word to, communicate and write, your ideas down and share them with a large number of people. We're now doing that at a much larger scale with the internet and with social media. And there's some question of like, yeah, is the written word even gonna work? Is everyone gonna be so focused on videos that writing itself, I mean, I noticed the way that my younger sister consumes information, in these snippets from social media. I do worry. I do worry about that because I think there's something about written word that is really fundamental to having these values that I've been trying to talk about. And the ability to make arguments in that way and the context that it enables. So we'll see. Right now, yeah, all news organizations are trying to figure it out because they can tweak their algorithms on the social media companies and it'll dramatically change what gets traffic and so on. And you know, I so anyway, that's a huge thing. I don't buy the catastrophist view that disinformation is spreading and that's somehow a new problem and that it needs to be regulated to control the spread of disinformation. I think that's been something that's overstated. I think the TikTok problem is a huge problem because it's our geopolitical adversary that's controlling
Yeah.
a huge part of the news diet of our young generation of people. But I think, some of the alarmist stuff is too much, but we're just still figuring it out, and it'll probably take decades.
Have you written about TikTok, by the way? I'm sorry if I've missed an article.
I have not. I've thought about it. I've seen. I don't know if I have anything. I mean, I've never had a TikTok account, and I've seen the argument. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the case for banning it, right? I think.
Yeah.
Um, I,
It just
I,
seems
I
very weird that we've allowed China, who's our adversary and now increasing their nuclear arsenal aimed at us, to dictate what information tens of millions of American kids are getting. I mean, that's a very weird thing. If you transpose that into 1933, coming out of Berlin, I very much doubt Roosevelt would have been open to that.
Yep, exactly. And I think, yeah, and Trump tried to ban it the first time around,
Hmm.
kind of failed, and since then it's gotten more popular, and they spend a lot of money. I mean, I noticed that the last Republican debate, they were one of the main advertisers in the commercial breaks because they know that there's Republicans are skeptical of TikTok, and they're trying to convince them by showing this very benign image of
Well,
of their.
maybe there's your next job that I'll commission you like Lorenzo de Medici with Michelangelo, and I'll say, listen, paint us a really good piece on TikTok from the right and why we need to do something about it, irrespective of whatever else. I have a question quickly to ask you here, just a personal curiosity. In terms of history, you studied history. What what period or what were you most interested in, or what did you zero in on in terms of your field of study? My son John, who was in the United States Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, when he got back from those wars early in that process, he went to the University of Chicago and majored in modern European history. So, what was your history major? What were you interested in?
It was U.S. history.
Good.
It
Any
was
any
not.
specific part of that
I mean,
project?
I forget how exactly they made us do it. I took, a number of courses. I wrote, I wrote a paper about actually about these free speech and Western civilization debates at Stanford in the 80s and 90s. But I'm very interested in the American Revolution and the early American history, the 1790s
Hmm.
period, especially. I've written some about this. I did an interview with Gordon Wood, who's the great historian of the founding, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, and because I think the divide in the 1790s between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists has a lot to teach us. It doesn't map on perfectly to either side, but with the Federalists, but it does, it was as polarized as
Hmm.
we are and reflected fundamentally, different views of human nature and the kind of regime that we wanted to have with and accusations of foreign interference and so
Yeah.
on. So that's a period that I'm interested in, and the founding, the and the Constitution
Yeah, I
generally.
think some of that comes through in your writing because when you write about free speech issues and so on, I can feel a pretty deep foundation there. You're not dropping sentences in that you just thought of. There, this is part of an overall worldview that you have. I'm interested, and I'm sorry if this is too on the nose here, but you came out of a Reformed Jewish background. The whole Jewish identity thing right now is kind of at a fraught moment. I mean, when isn't it in history? But it is happening right now again here in the United States. How do you read that? Forget the politics. Just in terms of, gut reaction to what's going on with Hamas and Israel. I'm not asking for a political point of view on how you regard that war. I'm speaking very personally to you about just how it is day to day, how you feel emotionally about this, if at all. Have you written about that? Some comedian had a sentence that was great a little while ago that always made me laugh. Something to the effect, after one of the scandals in Hollywood with a stand-up who was, then termed anti-Semitic or something like that. He said, listen, we all got to learn a lesson. Nothing good comes out of any sentence that begins with the words, the Jews. Don't go there, this or that or the other. So I'm not going there. How are you're talking about vitriolic, hate-filled responses to some of your posts. Does any of that get into the fact that you're Jewish in addition to being center right, or is that those two things separate?
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that in any responses. And, I'm not recognizably Jewish in my
No,
name.
that's not your thing.
Yeah,
That's not your thing.
I did once have the Daily Stormer, I think in 2017, write which is a anti-Semitic site, write a thing about me. And they seemed to figure out I was Jewish somehow and wrote this, put a Star of David and stuff. But I mean, no, so but look, I do think a lot. I think it's I told you one of my mentors was Walter Russell Mead, and he has a
Sure.
book about the U.S.-Israel alliance. And one of the lines early in the book is Israel occupies a speck in the map of the world, but it occupies a continent in the American mind.
Yeah.
I think that's, true. Israel, these debates about Israel, why do they resonate so much with us? It's a small country. It's um, there's bigger wars happening in the world. Why does it resonate so much? And it's, there's just a lot of dimensions to it. I mean, some of us see, Israel's founding to kind of mirror our founding, and that a country was kind of willed into being with the Declaration of Independence and the modern world. We have these well-known debates about, and it was formed in the context of United States-Soviet competition after World War II. The Holocaust is a part of American American history of World War II, which was our defining war of the 20th century. But it is and I think, and this is again, I'm because I learn about this, a lot of this from Walter Russell Mead, but he says, when Jews are doing well in a society, or when the anti-Semitism is low, that's usually a sign that the liberal values in the society overall are healthy. And when anti-Semitism rises, that tends to be a sign of conspiracism and other sort of a symptom of deeper problems in the power in the way that the society conceives of itself socially. So I think that's, and so I think, right now you're seeing, these frictions on the left be projected onto the Israel debate with claims about colonization and whiteness and so on. Even though the fact the Jewish diaspora, American Jews have been successful, and American Jews tend to be Ashkenazi Jews, at least non-Orthodox American Jews, tend to be Ashkenazi Jews. In Israel, a lot of the Jews were expelled from other parts of the Middle East and are Middle Eastern Sephardic Mizrahi Jews. So we have all sorts. We have a tortured relationship, I think, with Israel, and are Jews associated with Israel? And I guess even more fundamentally, we're having this big debate in our country about nationalism, and Trump was a nationalist.
Well, and Christian nationalism, and by the way, as you well know, one of the fascinations with Israel is because we have a huge evangelical Christian population that now is declaring themselves often to be Christian nationalists and proudly taking that mantle. And ironically, of course, this is a population that is very pro-Israel in the sense of being Christian Zionists, but it's not a Jewish Zionism. It's a Zionism predicated upon the return of Christ, who then, according to the book of Revelation, will kill all but 144,000 Jews who have had the good sense to convert to Christianity, upon his arrival. So it's a very weird Zionism that I think a lot of Jews have underestimated in terms of the hook in it. It's something I know about because I come from that background. So America is really complicated. It's not like France or Great Britain or, say, Germany now with its reflexive pro-Zionism, pro-Israel because of its horror history. The US has this population of evangelicals which have a theological interest in Israel, which is not necessarily pro-Jewish, but is pro the existence of the state for biblical revelation prophecy fulfillment purposes, which actually turn out to be pretty damned anti-Semitic at their heart, in a really weird way. So, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but by the way, this would be a good series of columns for you to write. I think you'd be the guy to do it
Well,
if you want to go there, because it's a very strange relationship.
well, you know more about the theology than I do. I would be fascinated to learn more about it. I mean, I get the sense that part of it in the evangelical, the way that you put it with uh the return of Christ and killing, and is that really the core of the evangelical support for Israel? I get the sense that it's more, admiration for the state, the sense that, creating a state out of nothing is sort of like a miracle, and sort of, not necessarily literally adhering to these things. But I really don't know about the.
Well, I think you're completely right. But I mean, from my own personal experience, I can remember actually the place I was. I was sitting in a bathtub once as a child in one of the wars that Israel was fighting, after its establishment. And my mother knocked on the door and said she had just heard on Voice of America, which was the armed forces radio for Europe, for American troops in Frankfurt and other places in the 50s. And then in the 60s, that, Jerusalem had been retaken, and that this is great because it brings us one step closer to the return of Christ, as in this is a fulfillment of prophecy. And I'm not the only kid growing up in a household where that was believed. And I think that a lot of whistling past the graveyard in terms of the Jewish community being glad of that support. Let's not look at, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, but it's not straight up support for Israel
Well, it's
for.
part of, and it's part of this, you're absolutely right that support for Israel in the United States, which is a big source of Israel's power and
Yeah,
sustainability, was among liberal, on the left in the United States, and liberal
sure.
Jews. And now it's increasingly becoming polarized by party. I'm not convinced that support for Israel is declining. It's just more sorted by party, and it's more
Yeah.
concentrated in the Republican Party. And Israel is certainly relying on that more. And that
Speaking of which, what do you think about that in terms I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm really interested in your point of view on this. How does that make you feel in terms of a shift that, you could assume that liberals supported the state of Israel up to a point, and you still see, people stepping out, the Clintons and others, front and center on the whole thing. And now all of a sudden it's flipped. But historically, and I know you know this, historically Israel's worst enemies in terms of not just the state, but Jews, hello, it wasn't the left in Europe that went after them. It was the right in National Socialism out of Germany and so forth. So it's kind of a weird thing that the people who in America are closest to the National Socialist idea of nationalism and all the rest of it in the kind of extreme right MAGA Trump party wing of the Republican Party, kind of pro-Israel, but that's the same group you're talking about. You got a Star of David in the Stormer or whatever,
yeah.
they also supported Trump. So we're in a weird kind of twilight zone here. And I just wonder whether you're unpacking this in any articles or thinking about it yourself, or maybe we still have to see how it shakes out. I mean, this is a huge moment. It's a shift. Right wing support
It
of
is a
Israel and
huge.
left wing beginning to support Hamas. I mean, what do you go figure?
It is a huge shift. And I mean, I forget where I heard this. Somebody said the far left doesn't like Jews in Israel. The far right doesn't like Jews not in Israel. So, but it goes to sort of bigger questions. And I think, it used to be that the left and right were divided by economics primarily.
Hmm.
And the Marxian tradition, it was about the capitalists and the working class. Now we're seeing a shift for what it means, where the right is increasingly composed of the working class, and the division between left and right is more about nationalism, against internationalism and cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, and traditional cultural values versus universal uh, global values. And so where does Israel fit in that? Well, it's the ultimate national state. It's the national state
Sure.
of the Jewish people. And so that, as a result of that, you see the right more sympathetic to it, and the left less sympathetic to it, because it sees nationalism as cruel, nationalism as exclusionary. Um, and so, I think that's a feature, this shift in Israel's position is a feature of the way that the sort of the end of the Cold War and the end of the communist versus capitalist competition and the rise of this new kind of division between left and right.
I think that's right. And it's another one of these things, we're all on our own journey, but how interesting, or maybe too interesting, to be alive at a moment when there are such massive shifts under our feet. I mean, you picked a good moment to be a columnist. I'm not being facetious. You have plenty to write about. You're not going to run out of material because, history is not asleep now. History is wide awake, and it's happening all around us, and we're all involved in maybe sinking or swimming or whatever. But, this is a big moment. My guest today is Washington Post columnist Jason Willick. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is where I do my commentaries, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And as I said earlier, Jason, it really disturbs me that a lot of people who identify from the left or the right are living in these crazy ideological bubbles where they won't talk to each other. And I just want to say to my left wing friends and some folks who follow me and so forth, because of my journey out of the right wing, and I'm a vociferous critic of the right and MAGA and Trump and the evangelical right and Christian nationalism and all the rest. That said, I don't agree with everything Jason writes. Why should I? But everybody's complaining, saying, well, show us some people on the conservative side that are reasonable, that you can talk to, that aren't conspiracy theorists, that are rational, that can put a sentence together, that have studied, that are intellectually viable. Well, Jason Willick is one of them, and he's a great writer. And if there's anybody watching this that's saying, why is Frank interviewing somebody, who describes himself as more conservative or center right? My response to you is, well, if you want to live in a divided culture that destroys itself, be my guest. But this podcast is going to reach out and talk to people we agree with and disagree with, and do so in a rational, civil, kind manner. And don't complain that there's nobody we can talk to on the right when somebody like Jason is there writing lucid, thoughtful pieces. So I want to thank you for what you're doing, Jason.
Well, thank you you have a great show. We were talking about the problems with information technology and just getting snippets. It's always great to have the chance to be able to, talk about context and with more subtlety than you sometimes get to in our information age.
Well, every time I see your name come up, I pop in. It's the first thing I read. I scan the post every morning. You've got a faithful reader in me, and my response is one of gratitude, whether I agree or disagree, because you think things through and you're fair. And that's the best compliment I can pay anybody who calls themselves a journalist. So thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it. And please get in touch with Ernie or me anytime you feel like you want to say something, or you write a book, or you want us to help promote something you're doing. I believe in your work, and I like your writing a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate it.
Take care. Okay.